everyone, welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. The complex diplomatic spat between China and Canada has been intensifying, with both countries issuing travel alerts and putting trade deal negotiations on hold. Today we get down to the bottom of the diplomatic dispute and discuss how it is set to progress from here on out. For that, we have with us Dr. Kim Sang-woo, the chairman of the East Asia Cultural Project. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here.
On January 14th, a court in Dalian, China sentenced Canadian Robert Schellenberg to death on charges of drug trafficking. While he was initially handed a 15-year jail sentence along with a $22,000 fine in 2016, his case was suddenly reviewed and a retrial led to the death penalty. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has since accused China of arbitrarily applying the death penalty.
It is of extreme concern to us as a government, as it should be to all our international friends and allies, that China has chosen to begin to arbitrarily apply death penalty.
In response, China refuted Canada's claims.
我们敦促加方尊重法治，尊重中国的司法主权，纠正错误，停止发表不负责任的言论。
Some U.S. media outlets like The Wall Street Journal interpreted the ruling as China's strategy to pressure Canada in releasing Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou from her house arrest. Earlier on December 1st, Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of Huawei President Ren Zhengfei, on charges of violating sanctions against Iran. This was at the request of the U.S. At that time, the Chinese authorities and Huawei strongly protested the arrest, claiming that it was a violation of political human rights. Following the arrest of Meng, 2 Canadian citizens were detained in China. They are Michael Spavor, a Canadian consultant who has worked extensively in North Korea, and former Canadian diplomat Michael Kovrig. Their arrests have triggered speculation that these are mere retaliatory measures by China for Meng's arrest. What's more, both the Chinese and Canadian governments issued travel warnings discouraging their citizens from traveling to these countries. Canada has arrested an important Chinese business figure, and China is now taking retaliatory measures. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we sit down with an expert to analyze where the diplomatic relationship between the two countries are headed.
Dr. Kim, so the relationship between Canada and China was very good even until November last year. But then in a matter of 2 months, it has escalated into a very bad diplomatic relationship. Why do you think is the fundamental reason for that?
Well, as you rightly pointed out, Justin Trudeau's Liberal government has been very friendly towards China. And they have been even negotiating free trade agreement and even the extradition treaty, mutual extradition treaty between the two countries. And now with the diplomatic row, that has all gone up in the air and no one knows the outcome. The main reason behind this is, of course, the arrest of the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, on the 1st of December. This was upon the request of the U.S. And Canada obliged to do this because under the mutual extradition treaty, they had no other alternative. But this, of course, now is escalated into a major diplomatic conflict between not only the Canada and China, but it's more like the Western countries are also supporting the Canadian stance because that they follow the rule of law and they are democratic countries, whereas China they consider to be a totalitarian government and a communist state, which one-party rules. So therefore, at the moment, there are some developments which shows some possibility of easing of tension, but we still need to see what final outcome will be. On the 6th of February, there will be a hearing for Meng Wanzhou's extradition, and the U.S. has to prove that they have a case against her. And if Meng Wanzhou wants to contest this, she can fight, and it will drag on for years. And that also needs to be seen.
Shortly after Meng Wanzhou was arrested, China detained a Canadian man for drug trafficking. Do you think this is acceptable diplomatically?
Well, actually, the Canadian who was arrested for drug trafficking was sentenced. He was arrested in 2014, and he was sentenced to 15 years. And that trial took about 4 years to sentence. And the Canadian, whose name is Robert Schellenberg, contested this, and he appealed. And after Meng Wanzhou's arrest, suddenly the Chinese courts decided that this sentence was too lenient. And in January, they actually upped the sentence to a death penalty, which is quite unusual because not only was the trial very quickly done, in a day actually, there was no new evidence presented for that case. But there are other two detainees that have been detained since the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. One is Michael Kovrig, who is a former diplomat, and the other is Michael Spavor, who is actually a businessman doing business with North Korea.
How about when it comes to the legal grounds, when talking about the legal affairs here? Even though you said Canada did this upon U.S.'s request, but does Canada still actually have the legal grounds to arrest Chinese citizen upon U.S.'s request?
Yes, under the treaty, that is completely legal, as you say. But it's not, they're not actually going to try Meng Wanzhou. They're going to hear a hearing, and the U.S. Justice Department will make a case against her. And if they see that, if the Canadian judiciary sees that there is merit to that, then they allow the extradition to take place. But as I said, as a rule of law and the due process of law, Meng Wanzhou can contest this. She can fight and she can appeal, and it may take years before the final verdict is reached.
Diplomatic dispute is intensifying, so we will connect to local experts to hear the local sentiment.
Sure.
To glean more information on the issue, joining me now is Professor Paul Evans at the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. A delight to be on the program.
Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou is currently under house arrest at her home in Vancouver. China says her arrest, which is at the center of a complex power game between the two countries, is largely political. What do you say?
Well, this is indeed an escalating conflict between Canada and China, and it's an unfortunate conflict because it is essentially a U.S.-China dispute that is behind what's happened with the arrest of Madam Meng. It is partly political, and it's partly legal. The legal part is that, according to our laws, which are strictly enforced, there's a regular way of handling these requests from the United States, and we have usually very little option except to make an initial arrest. How it's political is that it has now escalated into a conflict between Canada and China, with the Chinese detaining 2 Canadians, and in a case of a 3rd Canadian who had been convicted of a drug offense, having him on a death row capital punishment route. So what is at one level illegal is at another level very political. The big politics is the relationship between the United States and China, which this is about. Canada's caught in the middle of a technology war between the United States and China. Huawei is at the center of that, and Madam Meng is at the center of the Huawei controversy.
Okay, so what is the local sentiment in Canada about these issues, and especially on the death penalty that was sentenced to Robert Schellenberg?
Well, this has become a political issue between the two countries and has hit bilateral relations, but it's also a public issue, and it is the reactions of the Canadian public to this growing dispute are emotional. There's a new negativity about China that we haven't seen before. Canadians feel that China has improperly detained two Canadian NGO representatives. In this case, there's a double layer, that other layer being the concern that this is a kind of hostage taking by the Chinese and a punishment that is not just about Mr. Schellenberg, but is about the deteriorating state of Canada-China relations.
Canada and China have been discussing this free trade agreement deals. They have been having negotiations. But do you think this incident will actually affect their economic cooperation?
Well, I think it's already affecting economic relations between the two countries. We have a reduction in tourism in both directions. The bigger question is how it's going to affect Canada and China's effort to create some kind of free trade agreement. It was not going very quickly even before this new episode. But right now, it's hard to convince the governments on both sides that there is the level of respect and trust that is necessary even to get into a serious negotiation. We hope that will pass. It's essential for Canada and China to find new ways, not just to boost trade, but to put in new kinds of rules and regulations about how we do trade. And at this moment, that's going to be a very difficult order. Maybe in a month or 2 months or 6 months, we'll be able to revisit. But this is a difficult moment on many levels of the economic relationship.
Thank you very much. That was Professor Paul Evans, a global affairs expert at the University of British Columbia. Now, Dr. Kim, you just mentioned about these boycotts that was in place, imposed in many other countries other than just Canada on the Huawei products. But why do you think China is just attacking Canada for this?
Canada is the only country of the Five Eyes that has not yet banned Huawei for the implementation of the 5G network within the country. But I think this kind of bullying and this kind of pressuring on the part of the Chinese government towards Canada will backfire because, as Professor Evans have mentioned, the sentiment within the Canadian people is very negative against China. And because of the way of the dealing of the Canadian detainees, because they're not allowed a lawyer, the two detainees that I mentioned, the two Michaels, they're not allowed to have a lawyer. They only have a counselor visit once a month. They are under questioning at least 4 hours a day, every day. And under Chinese law, they can keep them detained for 6 months. And the treatment that they're receiving is unfounded because the Canadian government have asked the Chinese government to let them know what basis, what charges that they are bringing against them and what kind of evidence they have. And they have not been open with that as well. So there is a serious concern that the Chinese now feel that they have the ability or the strength to actually do whatever it likes to do in the case of Meng Wanzhou case. And they are bullying and pressuring Canada. And Canada is now developing a kind of a network of allies to support their position. And China is very sensitive to that. International opinion is quite something that China is always sensitive about. They want to be perceived as a normal country and an internationally respectable country. So I think in a way, Canada and China, the confrontation that they're facing is going to, not in the near future, it will escalate. And they will do on both sides whatever they can in order to achieve their objective. But in the long run, the long term, both countries would have to find a way out of this escalation of conflict, because China also wants to have Huawei 5G network contracts within the other countries as well. There are still countries like Poland, which recently have arrested a Huawei employee executive for espionage. And Poland is also considering looking into banning the Huawei for the 5G network as well. And they have also made some appeal to the EU to consider this as well. So China is very sensitive in this sense that they should cool down and not be perceived as being the so-called bully of the international community.
Right, this is not an unprecedented incident just in China, but we'll come back to whether China will change their adamant mind and stance about this issue.
Thank you.
We continue our discussion with another expert in Hong Kong. Joining me now is Professor David Law, Sir Y.K. Pao Chair in Public Law at University of Hong Kong, also a Charles Nagel Chair of Constitutional Law at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Canada is saying that China is arbitrarily applying death penalty on a Canadian citizen over drug trafficking as retribution for Chinese telecom executive Meng Wanzhou's arrest. What do you make of this? And is drug smuggling normally punished with death penalty in China?
Yes, so the death penalty for drug trafficking, we start with that part. That is quite common in China. The problem is we don't know exactly how common it is. China is known for a large number of executions, but it's also known for not being transparent at all about how many executions there are. So if we look at just the death penalty decisions that are reported publicly, there have been about 800 or so over the last 5 years, and about 130 of them have involved drug trafficking. So that's around 1/6 of all executions in China are for the death penalty. The Chinese criminal code provides for the death penalty for anyone who has more than 50 grams of methamphetamine. And this guy, Robert Schellenberg, the Canadian here, had over 200 kilos of methamphetamine. Now, that's a huge amount, right? That's obviously way over. It sounds like it makes sense that Schellenberg has been sentenced to death. But the real problem is the timing and the procedures that were used. Before Canada detained the Huawei executive, Meng Wanzhou, Schellenberg had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, and he had appealed his sentence. Now, under Chinese law, normally, if a defendant appeals his or her sentence, he or she cannot receive an even higher sentence. In this case, they used a loophole and they said, well, we can't impose a higher sentence, but we can send your case back to the lower court for a new trial. And the lower court technically is allowed to impose a higher sentence after finding new facts. And that's exactly what happened. And it happened in just 1 day. In a 1-day proceeding, they found that there were new facts that called for a heavier penalty. And at that point, they sentenced him to death. And Schellenberg's lawyer said that prior to the detention of Meng Wanzhou, there hadn't been any movement in this case or any suggestion that the Chinese authorities were going to seek a heavier sentence. Even worse, China's ambassador to Canada has written in a newspaper editorial that the detention of 2 other Canadians is a form of Chinese self-defense. Those were his words. And he basically admitted in a Canadian newspaper that China's retaliating against Canada for the detention of Meng Wanzhou.
Well, some commentators say that China is leveraging this Huawei case to attack Canada instead of directly attacking the U.S. amid their trade disputes that has been ongoing with Washington. So what do you make of this?
You know, the Chinese leadership desperately fears loss of face or embarrassment. And it's also important to remember here that China is not a democracy. And what that means is, in order for the Chinese government to enjoy legitimacy, they have to find some other way. And one way of doing that is scapegoating and blaming foreigners. Now, there have been times when that's been the Japanese. Recently, it's been South Korea. And right now, it looks like it's Canada. The Chinese economy is slowing down. China is not in a good position to fight back against the United States in an upcoming trade war. And so the easiest way for them to not lose face is to pick on Canada, which is, you know, China doesn't need Canadian consumers the way it needs American consumers. So we are just a much easier target. Canada's an easier target. South Korea is an easier target. And it does look like that's what's happening.
The 2 countries have issued travel warnings for both of the countries. Do you think their diplomatic relationship will actually worsen in the near future?
You know, the problem is that Canadian politicians, Prime Minister Trudeau, he really cannot give the Chinese what they're demanding. You know, one problem here is that if he is seen as interfering with the extradition judge's decision, he will be greatly punished by Canadian voters for sacrificing the independence of the Canadian judiciary, which means a lot to all Canadians. That's one of Canada's defining traits as a nation. And also he will be punished politically for seeming to back down in the face of China, which is seen to be a giant bully. So Prime Minister Trudeau doesn't have a lot of leeway here. He doesn't have a lot of tools at his disposal. And meanwhile, as I've suggested, the Chinese leadership, by going so aggressively after Canada, hasn't really left itself a way to back down in this confrontation. So it's really not clear how things will get better. And maybe the most realistic strategy is the current Canadian strategy of hoping that things will simply get better with the passage of time. One thing that Canada's fairly good at doing, whether it's dealing with a bully like Donald Trump or a bully like China, is trying to turn the other cheek, to remain relatively calm and pragmatic. But even Canadians have their limits.
Thank you. That was Professor David Law from University of Hong Kong. Dr. Kim, what did you think about the analysis of Professor? Do you think this Huawei extradition case will actually negatively affect the ongoing trade relations between Washington and Beijing?
I think that President Trump has already declared that he is going to directly confront China against not only the trade imbalance, but also the technology dispute as well. Technology, not just Huawei and the 5G network system, but the Trump administration and many now in the U.S. Congress is also thinking that the Chinese has been stealing technology from the U.S. and that they feel that Huawei's 5G network will be the mother lode in that area. So therefore, the U.S., although they have disagreements with the president, the Congress is fully behind the president in this case where they are confronting China. The U.S. in 2001, when they helped China to enter into the WTO, they really figured that China will change and become a more democratic country, a normal country in their eyes. But actually, with Xi Jinping, since 2013, China has become even more totalitarian in its way, and the Communist Party has become even stronger and more influential. Even private companies like Huawei has a communist committee within their company. So the perception of the outside world is that China is a one-party state and it controls everything, not just the judiciary, but also the legislature and the executive. And the Communist Party is the center of all that. So therefore, I think the U.S. cannot back down on the conflict and confronting with China. And I think what China is doing is that they have now realized that they are not in a strong position to directly or to confront the U.S. So they are making some concessions and backing down, but without losing face. They're trying very hard to not lose face against this and show that they are still standing on. But I think in a way China has come to the open too quickly. The Made in China 2025, which is to be technologically the advanced country in the world, and in a way Huawei is a figure showing that it is the #1 company providing telecommunication equipment in the world, #2 smartphone manufacturer. So it's the pride and joy of China. And the Chinese people are very proud of this. And to have the princess or the daughter of the founder of Huawei being arrested is very humiliating and raises a lot of public outcry. But having said that, therefore, they don't directly confront the U.S., but they are picking on Canada because Canada is much more easier to deal with than the U.S. I think China realizes that their ambition to become in 2035 the #1 economic power, and by 2050 even out militarily becoming even stronger than the U.S., will be disrupted. And the U.S. has made it clear that they will not allow this to happen.
Right, as you mentioned, Huawei is indeed the prototype of the grand strategy of China, what they are pushing for, made in China strategy, and the new Silk Road strategy that they have been talking about. Thank you very much for your expertise today.
Thank you.
The world is closely following the developments between Canada and China, which could bring about far-reaching consequences, not just for the two countries, but for the rest of the world. That's all we have for this week's The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in, and see you again next week.